Hello everyone, my name is Preston Dennett, and welcome to another episode of UFOs and the Paranormal. I've got a pretty unusual episode for you today. It's called The Smell of UFOs. There's been a lot of research into the various aspects of the UFO phenomena. People have studied landing trace cases, medical effects, animal effect cases, electromagnetic effects, UFO crash retrievals, UFO propulsion cases. Virtually every aspect of UFOs has been studied intensely. However, I was surprised to find out how little research there has been done into alien odors, or what UFOs and ETs actually smell like. And there are quite a few cases. I did some sniffing around and came up with more than 30 cases involving alien odors, and that's what this episode is about today. But before I get into the actual cases, I would like to make one point about alien smells and smell in general. The ability to smell is deeply connected to human memory. In fact, the olfactory nerve leads directly to the core of the brain. So memory and smells are inextricably connected, and this is why memories are often easily provoked by odors. And of course, scientists have long known that smell plays a powerful role in human behavior. It influences the appetite, the sex drive, physical attraction, and many areas of everyday life. And it should also be pointed out that smell for animals is often the superior sense. They rely on it much more than even vision or hearing. So the point is, smell is a very important sense, and it's been largely overlooked into how this is part of the UFO phenomena. So what I'd like to do is look into these cases of alien odors and see what they tell us about the UFO phenomena. And I've got a lot of cases I want to go through, so I'm going to go through them fairly quickly and see what we can figure out. And the first case I want to touch on is that of Whitley Striever. He's one of America's best known experiencers and has experienced a wide range of UFO encounters, and has of course written several best-selling books about his extensive experiences with the visitors. And on several occasions, he reports he has actually smelled them. On December 26, 1985, Strieber reports being taken from his cabin in upstate New York. And on board the UFO, he was shocked to find out that the interior of this craft was actually quite dirty. And as he says, I quote, "I know this is no dream. I'm sitting on a bench in a little room and it smells funny. It smells something like cheese in here. Smells kind of nasty, to tell you the truth. It's not clean in here. The space I entered smelled like warm cheddar cheese with a hint of sulfur." It was later on during this same experience that Whitley had a very strong fear reaction when the ETs informed him that they were going to perform an operation on him. He panicked and began screaming, and one of the ETs asked him, "Can we help you stop screaming?" And Strieber surprised himself by saying, "You could let me smell you." The alien then pressed her cheek up to Whitley's face, allowing him to smell her. And this worked. It calmed him down. So what do the aliens actually smell like? Whitley Strieber definitely has an answer. On February 7, 1986, he had an experience where he distinctly smelled them. As he says, "There is one earlier incident worth recounting, because it was this incident more than any other that opened the door to the past, and it did this via my sense of smell. The night of Friday, February 7, we spent in our apartment in the city. I was absolutely frantic. I had an awful feeling. I felt their presence. It was palpable. Most upsetting, I could smell them. I could smell a distinct odor, as if of smoldering cardboard, and it was familiar from my past. My wife could also smell this odor. It was one we had both smelled many times. Until now, I had not understood its significance. There was also another odor, as if of cheese and cinnamon, that I remembered from December 26. So for Whitley Striever, the smell of the aliens actually played a powerful role and was actually the impetus that led him to consider the physical reality of his experience. As he says, I remembered the odors I had smelled the night before. Odor is an excellent trigger of memory, and the odor of smoldering cardboard seemed to unlock a lot of doors. I last smelled it in 1972 or 1973. My wife and I had gone down to San Antonio to see my family, and we were sleeping in my sister's old bedroom. In the middle of the night, I suddenly awoke with the impression that I just heard a loud noise. I decided to get a glass of water. As I left our bedroom, I noticed a strange smell, like smoldering cardboard. As I went toward the bedroom to get my water, a small dark figure with a red light in its hand burst out of my old bedroom and dashed downstairs. So, yes, ETs do have an odor. Another case comes from an abductee by the name of Jean Marie Robinson, an abductee from Branson, Missouri, who wrote a book called Alienated. She has had lifelong contacts with a variety of extraterrestrials, and one of her first clues that she was having contact was an identifiable odor. As Jean says, and I quote, "Several times as a youngster, I noticed a strong odor on my hands and a brown substance under my fingernails. I recalled this substance smelled similar to beans and onions. I had not eaten anything that would have left this residue on my hands. For some reason, memories of those childhood incidents came back to me while I was listening to a boring lecture at college. I knew this was significant. Smell is a good memory trigger." So later, under hypnosis, Jean recalled the source of this odor. She recalled being taken on board a craft where she was surrounded by gray-type ETs and was shown several apparent hybrid babies. And it was then that she smelled this same odor. As she says, and I quote, "Two grays in another part of the room were busily preparing something. It was a bowl of foul-smelling substance. The smell was very offensive. It smelled of onions, garlic, beans, and some other odors I could not identify. The substance was the color of apple butter. A gray held the bowl, and I received a thought that I was to stick this substance and rub it on the baby." Jean Marie Robinson learned that this was how the babies received nourishment, and she was instructed to feed them in this manner on several occasions. But initially, her only clue that something had occurred to her was this strange odor coming from the traces of the substance left on her hands. So as you can see, odor is playing a powerful role in people's experiences. Another very famous case involving odors occurred on August 13th, 1973, to Police Sergeant Charles Moody, who experienced a UFO abduction while driving through the desert outside of Alamogordo, New Mexico. He had stopped to watch a meteor shower, and instead a large metallic disc swooped down and landed, and Moody was taken on board by ETs that looked very much like the modern-day Greys. This is a very well-known case, so I won't go too deeply into it, other than to report that Charles Moody did smell a strange odor while he was on board the craft. As Coral and Jim Lorenzen write from their report on this case, "From the time that Moody had come to in the white table room where he found himself on a table, he had noticed a sweet odor in the air, which he compared to burnt sugar, and throughout his stay on the craft, his breathing was labored." Another very famous case involving powerful odors is probably best known as the Flatwoods Monster, or the Braxton County Monster. This case occurred on September 12, 1952, and the main witness is Ms. Kathleen May, and 2 of her children, aged 12 and 13 years old, and 4 other children ranging in age from 12 to 17. All of them cited a large reddish glowing object which had landed on a nearby hilltop in Flatwoods, Virginia, and the 7 of them hiked up to see what it was and were confronted with a very, very tall, man-like creature, robotic-like creature with large eyes and a vaguely human appearance. The red glow was coming from a craft behind the creature, and the sight of this, quote, monster sent this little group of individuals into a panic, and they fled from the area. After they returned to safety, they were pretty much in a state of shock and had some disagreement on the actual appearance of the creature. However, what they all agreed upon was this weird odor, which was something like, none of them could ever forget it. Kathleen May said that the stench was unlike anything she had ever smelled, but that it was close to sulfur. The police were called and arrived on the scene with a local reporter, and the reporter, Ailey Stewart Jr., who had served in the Army in a capacity where he became familiar with the odor of a wide variety of gases, he smelled an odor which he described as sickening and irritating, but was otherwise completely unique to his experience. Another famous case involving odors occurred on December 20th, 1958, in the Swiss countryside, when 2 young men by the name of Hans Gustafsson and Stig Rydberg were driving along a remote road when they came upon a strange illuminated mist, and upon investigating they saw a metallic disc, and suddenly they were grabbed by 2 very strange creatures which looked like, and I'll just quote here, blobs, like protozoa, just a bit darker than most, sort of a bluish color, hopping and jumping around the saucer like globs of animated jelly. The drag the things exerted was terrific, and they gave off such a terrible smell, like ether and burnt sausage. The 2 men were terrified and escaped the grip of these gelatinous-like creatures and fled the area. At first they decided that they weren't going to tell anybody, but this odor was so bad that it was making them ill, and they had to seek medical attention. As Hans Gustafsson says, "We endured it for 3 days, and then we decided we should see a physician." As the report on the case reads, "The terrible stench seemed to stay with Hans and Stig. It seemed to have scarred their nostrils with its terrible odor." Investigators did research this case and found landing traces where this object had landed. It's one of the most unusual contactee cases because most involve humanoid creatures, but nope, this one involved gelatinous blob-like creatures. It's a very unusual case, but once again we have these very powerful and somewhat disagreeable odors. Not all of them are disagreeable. There's a very interesting case which occurred in April of 1955 to a cook from Loveland, Ohio. His name is Robert Honeycutt. According to the report on the case, Robert Honeycutt was driving home from work when he saw what he thought were 3 men praying by the side of the road. He noticed that one of the figures was holding a glowing rod, and that all these figures were about 3 feet tall, in uniforms, and were grayish in color, and as Honeycutt says, quote, fairly ugly. He walked towards the creatures and then decided he should stop and rushed back to his car. So he was hoping to get some additional witnesses. But as he was on the scene, he did notice a very powerful odor, which he described as, quote, an extremely strong odor which smelled like a combination of fresh-cut alfalfa and almonds. He decided he'd drive straight to the Loveland Police Department and reported his encounter to Chief Fitz. And Chief Fitz did confirm that Honeycutt reported this, quote, terrible odor. So, more and more cases keep turning up with weird odors. Here's a case which occurred in Hampshire, England, on November 6, 1967, to a truck driver by the name of Carl Farlow. He was driving his route when suddenly his headlights failed, and looking up, he saw a floating egg-shaped object. According to one report on the case, the object made a sound like a refrigerator and gave off a smell like a drill boring through wood. Another car arrived which had 2 passengers in it, and they also observed this object, which quickly moved away and disappeared off into the distance. By this point, however, Carl Farlow went into a state of clinical shock. Turned out the road itself was marked and the surface was actually partially melted. What's interesting, Timothy Good wrote about this case. Within a week of this encounter, all the evidence of the road having been melted was covered up, and the entire road itself was resurfaced for a 200-foot stretch. So it's apparent that the landing traces were covered up in this case. It's unfortunate because we could have gotten some real good evidence from that. But there are many cases involving odors. Another case occurred actually at Whitley Striever's cabin when he had invited a couple of people over to spend the night. This was in 1988, and one of the witnesses was Raven Dana. She woke up in the middle of the night to see a gray ET entering her room. It actually approached her quite closely, and she could smell it. She says that it stared at her a few moments, and that was when she noticed its odor, which she described as, quote, kind of a musty odor, like the wet fur of an animal. Not unpleasant, but very woodsy. Turns out another person at Whitley's cabin also had an encounter that night. Her name is Laurie Barnes. She was asleep in another room when she woke up to see what was apparently the same gray entering into her bedroom. And she gave an identical description, including its body odor, which she described as a musty odor. I would liken it to damp, woodsy. This really impressed Whitley Striever because they both used pretty much the same words to describe this odor. As Whitley says, it is interesting that they both used such a specific description independently. This implies a very identifiable odor, and more importantly, a real one. 2 people might well both imagine a scent, but not the same precise one, not after 6 years. I have been interested in their odors because I think of smell and touch as confirming senses, much more so than sight and sound. Over the years, I've tried to smell them and touch them as much as I could, and have noticed many different odors, the most notable of which is the human smell of them. Another interesting case took place in Ross, Ohio on November 19, 1973, when 2 anonymous gas station attendants witnessed a large glowing white light which moved towards their gas station and then blinked out. It was a brief encounter, but both witnesses did remark upon a powerful odor left by the object. According to the report on the case, and I quote, when the UFO disappeared, both attendants smelled the strong odor of sulfur. Also, a motorist driving in for gas remarked about the strong, offensive odor. Researcher Leonard Stringfield has uncovered some cases involving alien odors. As he says, and I quote, research records show again and again when humanoids are near, so is an odor. He quotes one case which occurred on October 2nd, 1966 in Cincinnati, Ohio, when a housewife by the name of Miss Everett Stewart was talking on the phone with a friend when she noticed a foul odor in the room, which was so strong it made her dizzy and nauseous. She hung up the phone and went to her bed, where she had the feeling of being watched, and looking out the window, she saw a large oval-shaped object with portholes hovering only a few hundred feet away. She woke up her husband, who also saw the object. She called her neighbor Janet, and as Miss Stewart says, "I was feeling quite sick when I called to alert Janet. The odor seemed stronger, and I was so dizzy I had to sit down." There were quite a few witnesses to this case. Miss Stewart called the police, who told her that they had already received more than 40 calls reporting UFOs in this area. By this point, the odor in her home was so strong it was intolerable, she said. And I quote, "It was an ill-smelling chemical odor, a smell that made me lose my equilibrium." Her neighbor Janet described the smell as exactly like, quote, "bad garbage." Eventually, the object did leave, but Miss Stewart was left in a state of near shock. It took her quite some time to recover. Not all smells are disagreeable. In 1950, 6-year-old Virginia Horton, that's a pseudonym used by Bud Hopkins. This case occurred, this is one of the cases that he wrote about in his best-selling book, Missing Time. So 6-year-old Virginia Horton had traveled outside her family barn to collect some eggs and experienced a typical UFO abduction. She gave a very detailed description of the inside of the craft, including an odor. As she says, and I quote, "I was lying on a couch, a little couch. It was comfortable, like a bed or almost like a medical thing. But it did not have the quality of a doctor's office. It's not chromy white. And the light's bright. There's plenty of light. I think it might be a pale or a soft gray. It's pearly, those kinds of colors. There was a luxuriant feeling to it, elegant and simple and rich. I'm trying to think if it had some smell. Clean. Really an ozone smell. That was the smell. Kind of a clean smell, but nothing very specific." So some of these odors, we start to get a lot of repetition, particularly of a sulfuric type odor. One such case was investigated by Jacques Vallée during a wave of sightings over Colares, Brazil, involving objects that the locals called chupas. And according to Jacques Vallée, and I quote, "I found little consistency in the descriptions of the beam itself. One of the witnesses compared it to an electric arc. On an interview tape, another witness said he remembered a bad smell, like an electrical odor, ozone, and saw a blinking light with pulsating colors inside." Vallée quotes another case involving a gentleman, a prospector, by the name of Manuel. And he also reported an odor. He was struck by a beam of light, and as Jacques Vallée says, every time the light hit him, he felt weak and fell. He also smelled a foul odor. In the whole incident, which Manuel calls the worst thing in his life, it was the smell that affected him the most. It was penetrating, like burning sulfur, and it made his nose run. It did not impair his breathing, but it forced him to clear his throat at frequent intervals. He believes it was the smell rather than the light that made him fall. So another really famous case involving odors is none other than Travis Walton. On November 5, 1975, Travis experienced a 5-day-long abduction that became very well known. This occurred, of course, outside of Snowflake, Arizona. Travis had a number of witnesses to his encounter who also saw the craft, saw him get struck by the beam of light. The men in the truck drove away and did not observe him actually get taken on board. But according to Travis, one of the first things he noticed when he was taken on board was the odor of the craft. As he says, "Where in the hell am I? Oh my God, it's the hospital. They brought me here to the hospital. It was very hot and humid. The heavy air was almost stifling. It smelled slightly stale and muggy. The heavy air was difficult to breathe." So this is a type of description we hear quite a bit. Another very similar description comes from Casey Turner, who is the husband of Carla Turner, author of Into the Fringe, Masquerade of Angels, and other books on the UFO phenomena. And according to Casey Turner, he had a UFO encounter, an abduction, and his description of the inside of the UFO, the smell of it, is actually pretty familiar. As he says, and I quote, "It feels small and dank, like a cellar, but not a cellar. It's not wet, but it smells yucky. Closed quarters, like an old gym, an old locker room." Another abductee who has reported ET odors is Kim Carlsberg, who wrote an excellent book called Beyond My Wildest Dreams. Also another book, The Alien Art. And she also reports a very powerful odor. As she says, "Have you ever experienced strange pungent odors like burning wire or rotting organic material without being able to locate the source?" Because she points to this as one of the clues of being an abductee. And she describes one of her experiences. And again, I quote, "Instantly, I felt claustrophobic, not due to the small enclosure, but due to the fact that I was packed in with many other bodies and jammed into a blind corner. Although I felt I was trapped by sentient beings, the stench of rotting organic matter was suffocating. I didn't know where I was, how I got there, or how I could have been taken from my bed in the middle of the night." One case involves a very specific odor. This case occurred in Beaumont, France on October 5th, 1954, when several witnesses saw a glowing object approach to within about 400 to 500 feet. And it left them in a state of temporary paralysis and then darted away. However, according to a report on the case, the object left a smell compared with that of nitrobenzene. The smell of nitrobenzene has been compared to the smell of almonds, by the way, which is interesting because that does turn up, as we have seen, in another case. So some of these, we're definitely beginning to see some patterns in these odors. Another really famous case was the star of Bud Hopkins' book, Intruders. Kathy Davis was the pseudonym. She's since come forward. Her name is Debbie Jordan Cauble. She's written a book about her experiences, which has just recently been released. I spoke with her directly, and she also reports smelling an odor during her encounter. And again, this was one of the first clues she had, was this strange odor. And as she says, and I quote, "I can smell burning matches. It smells like burning matches, and it stinks." Another case occurred in January of 1969 to a lady by the name of Anne Marie. This occurred in Springfield, Massachusetts, and Anne Marie was driving alone when she was stopped by 3 glowing objects which hovered over her car. She felt a blast of heat, and at this point a strange odor filled her vehicle. And as she says, "There was this very funny smell, almost like a skunk, but like a sweet skunk. You know, it was weird." At this point, the objects darted away. But Raymond Fowler, who investigated this case, says of this odor, "Have you ever played with an electric train and smelled the odor? I think it was ozone." So this ozone odor turns up again and again. Another very well-known case investigated by Raymond Fowler has come to be known as the Allagash abduction, involving 4 witnesses. There's 4 witnesses to this case, all of whom have apparently had a lifetime of encounters. 2 of the witnesses are actually twins, and one of the witnesses, his name is Jack Weiner, and he lives in Cape Cod, Vermont. And on May 21st, 1988, Jack experienced an abduction from his home. And he was pulled out of his home and led to a glowing craft that was actually landed on the ground. And as he was being taken into this craft, he smelled a very peculiar odor. As Jack says, "I smelled something weird. It smells like a freezer, maybe something like a freezer, like when you open one of those freezers with a lid and it smells tangy, sour, like cold or a chemical. It's a weird, weird smell." Another very well-known case is that of Betty Andreasen and her husband Bob Luca. And it was Bob Luca who actually reported smelling a distinct odor. In the summer of 1967, Bob Luca was abducted from his car while driving near Wallingford, Connecticut. It was a very typical experience. He was taken on board and examined. But while on board the craft, Bob Luca noticed a very distinct and recognizable odor. As he says, "There was no noise, but I smell ozone or something after an electrical discharge. In my work, I run into that a lot. It's just inside the room, like after a lightning storm, like after an arc of high tension or high voltage. There was an odor like that." Another case occurred in Caracas, Venezuela, to Miss Alicia Rivas Aguilar on September 8, 1973. Alicia was frightened by the appearance of a strange humanoid figure in a silver suit, which was floating outside her window. She began screaming. This brought in additional witnesses in her home, all of who saw the figure. But according to the report on the case, a strong smell, which resembled that of hot iron, was detected by all. Another very famous case occurred in Cherry Creek, New York on August 19, 1965. This is a very strange case. A whole family saw this object. There was a farmer and 3 children who observed this saucer-like object which landed in a neighbor's field. It was very brief. It instantly took off. And as this object took off, it left, quote, "an odor like burning gasoline." This incident was investigated by police and other officials, and was actually written up by the Air Force's Project Blue Book, who marked it as unidentified. I investigated a case personally involving a lady by the name of Pat Brown. She was a physical therapist from Panorama City, and in 1992 she began having a series of bedroom encounters with mostly gray-type ETs. She would later see human-looking ETs, but it's a quite complex case. I actually did a video on this. It's called "Be Careful What You Wish For," the Pat Brown story. So I won't go into all the details on the case other than to say that it does involve strange odors. On one occasion, she returned to her home and found it filled with this very peculiar odor. As Pat Brown says, and I quote, "One time I came into the house, and the house smelled so bad. It smelled like someone had left garbage, and I was trying to figure out what it was. An awful, awful smell, but I perceived that they had been there. I perceived that was their odor." Another case involving odors occurred on June 29, 1964, to a businessman by the name of Beauford Parham of Livonia, Georgia, who was driving near his home when a UFO swooped down from the sky and hovered over his car, causing the engine to sputter. and after a few minutes the object departed, leaving, quote, a strong odor like embalming fluid and a gaseous vapor. The witness himself says he felt a burning sensation, and the paint on his car actually bubbled following the incident. So it's a very interesting case involving physiological effects, physical effects, and a strange odor. So there are many cases involving odors. Another occurred on November 19th, 1980 in Longmont, Colorado, when a husband and wife were driving along and a UFO hovered over their car and pulled it up into the sky. They were taken on board this craft, and the witness, once he was taken on board, did notice an odor. As the report in this case reads, it was, quote, a strong odor that he thought was electrical in nature, and it pervaded the entire area. Another very famous case occurred in January of 1996 in Varginha, Brazil. This is a very well-known case involving two live ETs who were seen by the local townsfolk. This ET was up against a brick wall, and many people saw it. And what's really interesting is the odor that was described in this case. These beings were described as humanoids, about 3 feet tall, with dark brown hairless skin that was very oily looking. They had triangular heads with short protuberances on top and red vertically oval eyes. More than a dozen people in this town of Varginha saw these ETs, and what's important here was that an odor hung over the area, which was described as, quote, a smell like sulfur. One anonymous witness had a close encounter with gray-type extraterrestrials, and according to this witness, the ET did have an odor. As she says, her skin felt like very soft leather, and she had a pleasant but cheesy smell. One case that has become fairly well known occurred to a gentleman by the name of Eugenio Douglas. This occurred on October 12, 1963 in Argentina, and Eugenio had a close encounter with a UFO while driving. He stopped his truck and observed three figures exiting a craft which had landed along the roadside. These three figures spotted him and fired a beam of red light at him, causing a burning sensation. And according to the report on the case, Douglas could also smell a pungent gas. He had to be treated for severe burns, and later an investigation revealed that there was physical evidence at the site of the encounter. Another very well-known case is the Coronado Island UFO incident. Yvonne Smith wrote a book about this incident. I also co-wrote a book with Mike Evans on this particular case called the Coronado Island UFO incident, which occurred on March 26, 1994 at the Village Inn on Coronado Island. It involved multiple witnesses. What's interesting here is one of the witnesses, Laurie, had fully conscious recall of Grays entering into her hotel room. And she reported an odor, for sure, as she says, and I quote, "I see these small Grays come in. I've never seen them before. They smell really bad. They smell like, I want to say sulfur, rotten eggs. They come in through this window. They were small gray beings. They're really small, maybe 3 feet high and very limby, very spindly looking. Their torso is quite big. Their heads are large. They look disgusting." And they took her friend who was sleeping. Her friend has very little memory of this, just some partial memory. And at some point the Grays returned, and again she could smell them. As Laurie says, they smelled the same. they were terrible. Another case which involves odors is, of course, the very famous Roswell UFO case. According to the mortician Glenn Dennis, who was on the scene, he says that there was an odor. He spoke with the nurse who actually saw the bodies, and the nurse told him that the ETs had a terrible, terrible stench that was so bad it permeated the whole building and made several people sick. So, yeah, I mean, there are many more cases. It starts to get a little bit redundant. Here's a case which comes from a gentleman who heads what he calls the Orion Project, which is all about reptilian ETs. And as he says, and I quote, "Reptilians are notorious for having a very strong body odor, which most humans find very uncomfortable, almost like meeting a skunk. I described the smell of Hamish, the reptilian," that's the ET he reports seeing, as, quote, "the smell of vomit and old cheese, a very visceral smell." I found another case, which is anonymous, from a gentleman on the internet on the above top secret forum. And as he says, and I quote, "I've been told there are several abductees here who might know what I'm talking about. The Greys have this odor that is so bad it's enough to make you physically ill. It's a cross between a well-aged French cheese and the sulfurous smell similar to what a natural hot spring smells like. Are they a race of habitual non-bathers? Do they not have a good sense of smell? Is it from what they eat, like when you eat garlic or asparagus? Or is it because there are no shower facilities on spaceships? You'd think if they could build a flying saucer, they could invent perfume or antiperspirant or something. My last question is, do we smell as bad to them as they smell to us?" It's a good question. But apparently ETs do have a body odor. I wouldn't say it's necessarily bad. The sulfurous odor could be a product of them actually manifesting and all these electrical arcing odors. Researcher Eve Lorgan, who's quite a prominent researcher, made a list of all the signs that indicate a possible UFO experience. And on her list is, of course, these unusual odors. I did a whole study of this case in my book, Not From Here, Volume 2. And I think these odors do have quite a bit to tell us about the nature of this phenomena. I literally went through hundreds of cases looking for odors and came up with these few dozen. And I would say that these odors can be broken down into two main categories: organic odors and electrical odors. So these odors are described variously. The organic odors are described variously as cheesy, like cinnamon, like beans and onions, burned sugar, burned sausage, muggy, woodsy, like wet fur, alfalfa and almonds, rotten organic matter, a locker room, bad garbage, rotten eggs. I think this is important because what these odors tell us is that we are dealing with organic beings, beings who have a living body, beings very much like us. And remember, when someone smells something, it's because they are actually bringing in actual molecules into their nasal cavity. It's striking their olfactory nerve. So these odors indicate that this is an actual physical phenomena. So the second main category would be what I would call electrical odors. And this is a slightly smaller percentage, but as I mentioned earlier, this odor is a common side effect of electrical discharges. And this odor, is very consistent in a number of independent cases, so it's important that it provides really good corroborative evidence, but it's also important because it points to the nature of UFOs as being actual physical machines using high levels of electricity. It also points to the nature of UFO propulsion and the probability that we are dealing with an advanced technology of some kind. So some of the odors are difficult to categorize. I mean, like a clean smell or a chemical odor, like burning cardboard or burning wood, nitrobenzene, these types of things. It's very possible that these are just misidentifications of what we would think of as an ozone-like odor. But yeah, again, these odors are surprisingly consistent. I remember when I was talking to an abductee and I asked her about this, and she said what she smelled was beans and franks. And I thought she was kidding at first, but no, she was entirely serious. And I was quite surprised later to get additional reports involving this same odor. So, yes, as we can see, these odors do turn up. It's a fairly consistent feature of UFO encounters. The only other research I could find into UFO odors was done by UFO researcher Thomas Bullard, who considered more than 200 cases of UFO abductions, and of those 200, only 11 involved odors. As he writes, and I quote, "The witnesses smell an odor in 11 cases, usually ozone, or something described in similar terms, sulfurous, pine-like, or rain-like. Exceptions include a burnt sugar smell, a smell like chicken, or something burnt, or simply a bad odor. These smells may contribute to breathing difficulties mentioned in several cases, but the problem of air being difficult to breathe is widespread enough to occur in 21 cases." And Bullard's study shows pretty much the same thing we found out here, that these odors are organic on one hand and ozone or sulfurous on the other, which again indicates that these ETs are biological creatures and their craft are technological machines. So I think the most important conclusion we can draw from UFO smells is that the UFO experience is taking place in physical reality. Again, odors are molecular compounds which strike the olfactory nerve. And in many of these cases, these odors are being detected by multiple witnesses, which again confirms that UFOs and these occupants are material in nature. Some people have remarked upon the connection between bad odors and other manifestations of ghosts and even Bigfoot. So perhaps there are some weird correlations there. It's hard to say, but what we can definitely say is that UFOs do smell, and unfortunately it's not always pleasant, but it's certainly very interesting and consistent. So it's easy to speculate in this field. However, the facts speak for themselves. Odors are being detected in UFO cases. So if you ever have the opportunity to see a UFO or are taken on board, remember to use all your senses. Don't just look around and touch things. Try to smell what's going on, because these odors do provide a clue as to the nature of this phenomena, which is why I really wanted to do this video. I think it's an important piece of evidence that has been ignored for too long. So that's it for now. Hope you've enjoyed this episode, and until next time, keep having fun. Smell you later.